Good morning. My name is Walter Jones. I serve in the United States House of Representatives. I represent the 3rd Congressional District of North Carolina, and I'm delighted to have just a very few minutes to introduce your speaker today. When I came to Washington, it was in 1995. I was with the group that Newt Gingrich became our speaker. And at that time, David Walker was the Comptroller General of the General Accounting Office. And in the 10 years that he was in office at the beginning of my service in the United States House, there was no one in the United States Congress that I truthfully had as much respect for the honesty and integrity. There were times that I would hear David speak before a committee that I served on in an open session. Then we would have meetings with members from both parties who were concerned about the growing debt and the deficit of our nation. David very kindly accepted 2 invitations over a period of about 8 years by the university at East Carolina called East Carolina University School of Business to come down to do open forums, open to the public. And shortly after the first election of the President Obama, David happened to be down in eastern North Carolina at one of these forums. We had 300 to 400 people. Every time that he spoke would come, it was free, and they'd come and want to listen to the man that would tell you the truth about the direction of our nation. It was kind of amazing. He got a question from one of the individuals in the audiences, and the question was something like this: do you think Mr. Obama or even John McCain, who was the challenger, fully understand the depth of the problems facing our country? And Mr. Walker said, I don't really think they do fully understand the depth of the problems facing our country. David has worked so hard to wake up America before it's too late. And that's why today I was honored to be here to introduce him. This year, at the election of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, I nominated David Walker to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. When I made that nomination, the clerk turned to the parliamentarian and asked me to repeat the name of my nominee. So I had the privilege to stand up in the full house with everybody in the gallery and repeat that I am nominating David Walker, former Comptroller General of the General Accounting Office, to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. When the vote was over and I was walking out, I had a press person to stop me and say, why did you nominate David Walker to be Speaker of the House of Representatives? I said, because our country is heading for a collapse. We need honesty and integrity in the speakership of the House of Representatives. We need a leader that will be honest with the American people and try to direct the Congress toward integrity and honesty in dealing with the financial crisis headed for our country. Quite frankly, the reporter paused for a moment and he said, Congressman, that's a very thoughtful nomination. So with that, I introduce your speaker today, who I wish was my speaker in the House of Representatives, David Walker. Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank
you. Congressman Jones, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I will always be honored by your vote for Speaker of the House of Representatives. I think I'm one of the few Americans in history who was not a member of the House who was nominated, I think this time along with General Colin Powell, and that's pretty good company to be in. I want to thank all of you today for coming. I know that Congressman Jones has to leave early. He's going to stay a few minutes if he can. And you know, today is a very, very special day for a variety of reasons. One, it's Constitution Day. This is the 226th anniversary of the agreement on the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia. You'll hear more about that in a few minutes. And secondly, this is the exact 10th anniversary of my being in the same building at the National Press Club and giving a speech called Truth and Transparency, where basically I blew the whistle that Washington was out of touch and out of control with regard to our nation's finances. And so what I want to do today is talk about some of the things that we're issuing today, the Come Back America Initiative, where we've been, where we are, where we're headed, and very, very importantly, what do we need to do to create a better future? As you can see on the far right, there's a copy of the cover of our new report and our final capstone report for the Come Back America Initiative called America's Deciding Game, Winning the Future. Now, September is a very busy month, and some of us are baseball fans like myself, and we're really into the playoffs and who's going to make the playoffs. And while we care about that, and different people have their different favorite teams, in reality, whoever wins doesn't have a significant implication on our country and its future. On the other hand, September is very important in Washington because it's a big fiscal month. It's the last month of the year and preparing for the next fiscal year. And I can assure you that while we use a number of baseball analogies in the report, and I really encourage you to read the full thing, the consequences of who wins the so-called Fiscal Future Series, which is what we refer to in the report, is much more significant for our country and, quite frankly, for the world. Whoever wins this Fiscal Future Series, people that are fighting for fiscal sanity or people that are debt deniers, will ultimately determine our future position in the world, our future standard of living at home, and even the future domestic tranquility in our streets. It's that serious. 10 years ago, when I gave the Truth and Transparency speech, I felt that it would have been irresponsible and frankly downright unpatriotic not to speak up. In my opinion, 2003 was arguably the most fiscally irresponsible year in the history of the United States, and I'm happy to tell you why in Q&A if you want. Since 10 years, we have increased our debt 3 times. We've increased our total liabilities and unfunded promises more than 3 times, and our long-range outlook is much worse today than it was then, and you can see that from this next graphic here. So as a result, one of the things that I started 10 years ago was an effort to do what Congressman Jones says, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, to engage the public with that truth, to help them understand the need for action, the prudence of acting sooner rather than later, to try to provide some principles and values that bring people together rather than divide people apart, and then to show some sensible solutions, nonpartisan solutions that have the ability to gain bipartisan support. I've traveled over 1 million miles to all 50 states, to several countries, and I've engaged in consultations with elected officials from both political parties because I don't really care what your political party is. I care about the integrity of the person, and I care about results rather than rhetoric. Today, we're putting on our website, keepingamericagreat.org, this last capstone report, which I refer to, a fuller copy of my remarks for today. I'm summarizing my remarks today, and several YouTube videos that, due to the generosity of Ted Berger, who's here today, I don't know where Ted is, has funded the creation of several videos to try to help lay out these issues in clear, concise, and compelling forms, not just the problem, but potential solutions that will live past CAI's life. If I can, let me highlight some of the few hard truths as to where I think we are, because I hate to say it, but I don't think we're going to see a grand bargain in 2013, and my fear is that we may not get a grand fiscal bargain until after the presidential election and in 2017 or later, absent a market crisis. I don't like that, but most of the people I talk to that are knowledgeable about the situation believe that's the case. So let's talk about what the hard truths are. First, America has strayed from many of the principles and values that made our country great, and they've strayed from a number of the key concepts that are embedded in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, and I'll come back to that given that it's Constitution Day. Secondly, despite some progress in recent years, we are much worse off today from a fiscal perspective than we were 10 years ago, and I've talked about some of those statistics. In addition, the basic budget and appropriations process is broken. Believe it or not, only 4 times in the last 62 years has Congress passed timely budget and appropriations bills. 4 times in 62 years. And the only thing that the Congress is supposed to do every year under the Constitution is to deal with the appropriations process. That is an F-. It is an embarrassment that people should be downright ashamed of. And again, this year is going to be a continuation of that. 58th time in 62 years, they will have failed to discharge their responsibilities in a timely manner. The federal government is 11.5 times bigger today as a percentage of GDP than it was 100 years ago. It's gone from controlling 97% of annual expenditures to 34% and declining. We've got a situation where in the last year, there have been some steps to try to increase taxes on the quote-unquote wealthy, to cut discretionary spending, but in a mindless, across-the-board fashion. And the truth is, so far, Congress and the President have been dealing with the symptoms, not the disease. In order to treat our fiscal cancer, you must reform social insurance programs. You must rationalize health care promises and reduce health care cost growth. And you must reform the tax system, make it simpler, fairer, more competitive, more equitable, and to generate more revenues. And if you don't do those 3 things, then you're kidding yourself. You're not going to solve the problem. And I know that CBO is somewhat competing with us this morning. They're going to be issuing the new long-range budget simulation. It doesn't really make any difference what those numbers are. They're bad, and they get worse every minute of every day. And they're not treating the disease, they're treating the symptoms. That's the reality. The third hard truth: the United States currently has a republic that is not representative of nor responsive to the general public. We now have something that our founders feared: career politicians who may or may not have had a real job in their life, but once they do, they want to keep it for life. They're out of touch with reality. They don't live in the real world. And because of gerrymandering of congressional districts, dealing with very sophisticated computer technology, because of the duopoly of the 2 major political parties that control ballot access, because of campaign finance, because of the lack of term limits, and a variety of other factors, we now have gridlock. You know, gridlock can be okay when things are going well, because sometimes government can muck things up. That started with an M for the record. But when things aren't going well, having gridlock, when you have large, known, and growing problems that get worse with the passage of time, is totally unacceptable. And the truth is that Washington has become dysfunctional absent a crisis, but it's not too late to change course. I truly, truly believe that. And there's one really good piece of news in today's report that we're issuing, and that is the American public. As you look at this graphic over here, you will see that in the last 10 years, the public's awareness of and concern for the financial condition of this country and the potential implications of our children and grandchildren and future generation have grown dramatically, irrespective of their party affiliation. So the American people get it. They know you can't spend a lot more money than you make, charge it to the credit card, self-deal in your own debt, which is what's happening, and not have some type of day of reckoning at some point in time in the future. So if the American people understand that we have a problem, and they clearly do, then what's the problem? Why haven't we made more progress? In part because of what I said, we have a republic that's not representative of nor responsive to the public. From a fiscal perspective, federal policymakers and some prominent economists have a false sense of security about our financial condition. Yeah, this year our deficit's only going to be about $650 billion, down from over $1.1 trillion last year. First year in 5 years that we don't have a $1 trillion deficit. Newsflash, a $650 billion deficit is not good, especially when you know, based upon known demographic trends and rising health care costs, that it's going to rise to $1 trillion or more a year within the next 10 years, absent a change in course. From a monetary policy perspective, we've got an easy money policy where the U.S. Federal Reserve is self-dealing in U.S. government debt. That is not sustainable, and the truth is we are misusing the fact and abusing the fact that the U.S. dollar is a global reserve currency. And if it wasn't a global reserve currency, we would be in a world of hurt right now. We're losing market share. We'll continue to lose market share if we don't course correct. But from a practical standpoint, the Congress and the President need to do some type of a fiscal bargain before the Federal Reserve is going to be able to significantly change course, because the Federal Reserve now has a dual mandate, not just to try to be able to fight inflation, maintain reasonable long-term borrowing rates, but also they're supposed to be concerned with short-term unemployment, which has politicized the Fed, and in the absence of the Congress and the President being able to work together, they're the only game in town. From a political perspective, the state of affairs in Washington has become a national and international embarrassment. Elected officials are gridlocked on a number of important issues, and if they were paid for performance, they would owe us money. Yesterday, due to the tragic events at Washington Naval Yard, and all of us, I'm sure, are very concerned of that, and our hearts go out to those that were killed or wounded and their families and their friends. And of course, you know, the Congress ended up going into recess because of those events for security and other reasons. It's not like they were going to really do anything anyway, but at least today they're going to show up for work. It's incredibly frustrating when you see how poorly the debate is about our fiscal future and how fragmented it is. The truth is that we have too many Democrats and liberals that are in denial about the need for social insurance reforms. We need to do it to make them solvent, sustainable, and secure for the future. Too many Republicans and conservatives are in denial about the fact that because of known demographic trends, rising health care costs, and because of additional promises that in part they were responsible for making, that we're going to have additional revenues above current and historical average levels. But we need to get there through comprehensive tax reforms. And leaders of both political parties have been paying too much attention to the extreme factions of their political base rather than a significant majority of we the people. Having been to all 50 states, over 1 million miles in the last 10 years, I can tell you that in my view, 60% plus of Americans get it. They're in the center right or center left. They're willing to accept principle-based compromise if they get the right leadership. And the biggest deficit we have today is a leadership deficit, especially with regard to political leadership. So as we look to the future, we need to recognize that as the report lays out in much greater detail than I will now, we need a comprehensive and integrated strategy in order to achieve a real victory in what we refer to as the Fiscal Future Series. We need to set a realistic fiscal objective. We're not going to balance the budget in the short term. We're never going to pay off the U.S. debt. But believe it or not, we did once, 1835, 1836 under Andrew Jackson. It'll never happen again, and we don't need to do it. What we have to do is to focus like a laser on debt as a percentage of the economy. How much debt do you have as a percentage of your income? What's your ability to be able to service that debt without unduly mortgaging the future, if you will? So we have to set a realistic objective, and we have to be able to create a game plan that will get us to a reasonable level of debt to GDP within the next 10 to 15 years, and that will keep us there absent a declared war, given known demographic trends and rising healthcare costs. These 1-year and 10-year budget projections are myopic and misleading. We need to recognize that as Columbus proved in 1492, the earth is round, and so is our budget horizon. It's not flat. We need to look beyond the horizon. We need to take steps to deal with large known and growing problems. It's also time to change the way that the government keeps score. You know, the government talks about current annual deficits, 10-year deficits. The government talks about the national debt, which is about $17 trillion. When you came in, hopefully you got an opportunity to see the U.S. Financial Burden Barometer, which we took to 27 states around the country this past fall. That number is more realistic as to about where we are. It's the total liabilities and unfunded promises of the U.S. government, including unfunded Medicare, Social Security, pension, retiree health care promises, now totaling about $72 trillion and going up by several $1 million a minute by doing nothing. Now here's the good news. The good news is that if we do some type of a grand fiscal bargain, social insurance reforms, health care costs, comprehensive tax reform, the debt clock won't go down $1. Not $1. But that clock could go down tens of trillions of dollars, and the rate of increase could go down dramatically because of the power of compounding. As Albert Einstein said, the most powerful force on earth is not nuclear energy. It is the power of compounding. And the sooner that you end up making tough choices, even if those tough choices are phased in over time, which they'll have to be with regard to social insurance reforms and even some tax reforms, you get the power of compounding to start working for you. In addition, we've got to broaden the message to include state and local challenges. The truth is that all levels of government have grown too big, promised too much, and need to restructure. And most levels of government below the federal government are in trouble financially, and they have common denominators: huge unfunded retirement promises, outdated tax systems, too much spending on consumption, not enough on investment, and overregulation, among other things. We have to recognize the theory of gravity. Bad news flows downhill. When the federal government restructures, not if the federal government restructures, when the federal government restructures, hopefully prudently, preemptively, phased in over time, rather than suddenly, dramatically, in a draconian fashion because we wait for a crisis like some European countries, when it restructures, it's going to do less than projected and tax more than historically it's taxed. That's what it's going to do. So what does that mean? The states are going to get less. They're going to have to do more. The not-for-profit sector is going to become more important, and individuals are going to have to assume more responsibility for their own future. The younger you are, the better off you are financially, the more you're going to be affected, but that's how it should be. So if the states and localities have a problem now, they need to get their act together so they can get ahead of the curve, because the problem is going to become more acute in the future, not less acute. We need to employ new fiscal mobilization strategies, both inside and outside the Beltway. You know, we've got the Concord Coalition. Bob Bixby is here today. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Maya would like to be here, but she's up on the Hill. They've been around for a while. They continue to be involved in the fight. The Comeback America Initiative has been involved for the last 3 years. The Can Kicks Back, which you'll hear a little bit more a little bit later, the New Millennial Group who's focused on this, the Campaign to Fix the Debt, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, the Institute of Truth in Accounting. Sheila Weinberg is here today. These are all groups that have joined the fight to try to restore fiscal sanity. There's also some new groups, No Labels, of which I'm a national co-founder for, which is trying to bring people together to value progress over party and results over rhetoric. And I have to commend No Labels for their new 80-plus person problem solvers group in Congress and their Make Government Work initiative, which has an opportunity to really make some progress. And another group that I'm affiliated with, the Government Transformation Initiative, is trying to make a commission happen that can make recommendations to improve the organization and operations of government, to improve economy efficiency and effectiveness and accountability in a way that will be guaranteed a vote in Congress, up or down vote. Simpson Bowles, Domenici, Rivlin, these did not deal with these operational issues, and there are so many out there that could really help us restore fiscal sanity, get better return on investment, and take pressure off of the sequester, which again is a mindless, across-the-board approach, rather than a more targeted and intelligent approach to reducing spending. Not all spending is equal. Not all spending should be cut. In some areas, we should be spending more, like investments in our future. We need to build upon successful public engagement models. President Obama, quite frankly, needs to learn from President Clinton, who engaged the public with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, brought together bipartisan leaders of Congress in 1998, and I was part of this, to try to facilitate Social Security reform. He went to the people. He made the case to the people. He used nonpartisan or bipartisan professionals to make the case. The politicians listened to what the people had to say. There was an engagement with the people on what they thought about various reforms, and what it demonstrated was, as we did on our 10 Million a Minute tour last fall, the people are ahead of the politicians. They're willing to come together around tough choices, if they're part of a comprehensive plan that's principle-based and that they deem to be fair. That needs to happen. The truth is, President Bush 43 and President Obama have failed to lead on this issue, and that's got to change. But the truth is also that the bipartisan leaders of Congress have been more part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So the President has a disproportionate opportunity and obligation to lead, and the bipartisan members of Congress need to be there with the President, listening to the American people, and also using more sophisticated deliberative approaches such as Stanford University's Center for Deliberative Democracy. The media has got to play a much more constructive role. I mean, I do a lot of media. I do it because it's in the interest of the Come Back America initiative, not because I like to do a lot of media. But the fact of the matter is they're incredibly superficial. They like to have the left fight the right. They're focused too much on horse races. They're very short-term focused. It's the issue of the day or the issue of the hour. And it's extremely difficult to get your views across, no matter how worthy they are, if you're not running for office. Ross Perot demonstrated in 1992 that if you care greatly about something and you run for office, in his case, President of the United States, he got a lot more of a forum. And he made a difference, even though he didn't win, because it was part of the horse race. The media wanted to pay attention to him, and he helped to set President Clinton's agenda and, frankly, even the Compact for America. He even had an impact on the Compact for America. So he had an impact on both parties. But it shouldn't take somebody running for political office, much less President of the United States, to command the attention of the media and to get the media to focus much more on fact-based, nonpartisan, solutions-oriented approaches. We've got to fix our dysfunctional democracy. As I said today, we have a republic that's neither representative of nor responsive to the public. We've got to have redistricting reform, integrated and open primaries, campaign finance reform, and term limits. And in addition to that, I think it's time for a new state-led convention to propose amendments to the Constitution of the United States. We need to take advantage of the second option provided by our founders if the federal government ever got so far out of touch and out of control that it was as dysfunctional as it is today, which it is. The founders gave us an option where 2/3 of the state could call for a constitution for one or more reasons, that the Congress then would be required to set a date and time and place for that convention, and then the states would take the lead in coming up with what they felt would be appropriate. This would not be a convention to rewrite the greatest political document in the history of mankind, the U.S. Constitution. It would be a convention to be able to propose amendments for ratification by 3/4 of the states, dealing with things like fiscal reforms, political reforms, states' rights, unfunded mandates, etc., to be determined. The time has come because Washington is failing us. This leads to the biggest deficit that we have, which I've talked about, the leadership deficit. The CEOs at all levels have to step up, and the congressional leaders and legislative leaders at the state and local level have to value the people over their party and progress over stalemate. Last but not least, we need more independent and minded Americans. Individuals who may or may not be part of a political party, or they could be unaffiliated, as I am at the present time, but who value results over rhetoric, progress over partisanship. It was shocking to me to find out that the Tea Party movement and Occupy movement have a lot in common. You wouldn't think that, but they really do, and here's why. Because they both are concerned with the lack of integrity, transparency, and accountability. In the case of the Tea Party movement, they're concerned primarily about government. In the case of Occupy, they're concerned about Wall Street. And guess what? They have right to be concerned. And so what we have to do is to recognize what do we have in common, how can we bring people together in order to try to create a better future. We have to recognize that reality. So while CAI is going to discontinue our day-to-day operations at close of business this Friday, our staff's going to continue to fight for fiscal responsibility. Mike Murphy is at the Committee for Responsible Federal Government. Rachel Vierling is at the Can Kicks Back. I'm going to continue to be involved, but not on a full-time basis, on a much more timely and targeted basis. For the first time in my life, I'm going to take off more than a weekend between transitions in life and decide what I want to do next. But since we are leaving the day-to-day battlefield, it's important that other organizations stand up. In order to try to help make that happen, we've decided to give the U.S. Burden Barometer to the Concord Coalition. Bob, where are you? Bob Bixby is here because they specialize in grassroots effort. This is a way to try to help people understand the real problem and the magnitude of the problem, and to get credit if they do make some decisions that can make that number come down dramatically and the rate of increase slow dramatically. In addition to that, we're going to be providing some funding to the Concord Coalition, to the CAN Kicks Back, and to the Institute of Truth in Counting to try to be able to help them further their mission, dealing with millennials in the case of the CAN Kicks Back, and dealing with state financial challenges in the case of the Institute of Truth in Accounting. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the distinguished members of CAI's Board, Advisory Council, our funders, as well as our staff, and also thank my wife, Mary, who has allowed me to work 60 to 80 hours a week and travel 2/3+ % of the time over the last few years. I'm forever grateful for that. Also acknowledge that my brother is here, Steve, and my son, Andy, as well. I thank that, and many friends in the audience. I cannot thank you enough for being here today. Finally, a few thoughts on the Constitution, and then we'll wrap it up. As I said, today is the 226th anniversary of the signing of the U.S. Constitution, the greatest political document in the history of mankind. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about how we varied from the preamble of the Constitution and what do we need to do to come back to those time-tested values. In my view, it's time for us to form a more perfect union by returning to more of a federalist system of government and by taking steps to make our republic more representative of and responsive to we the people. Establish justice by recognizing that the law represents the floor of acceptable behavior, and by seeking to hold people accountable to higher ethical and moral standards, including holding policymakers accountable for their de facto intergenerational theft caused by our current fiscal policies and path. Ensure domestic tranquility by putting our finances in order while addressing the growing gaps in society in a manner that does not punish, success, or discourage people from working towards their vision of the American dream. Provide for the common defense based on credible threats to our national security in an affordable and sustainable manner. In this regard, as I said on 60 Minutes in 2007, the greatest threat to our national security is our own fiscal irresponsibility. Promote the general welfare by facilitating economic growth to create more jobs, investing in our future, and maintaining a sound, sustainable, and secure social safety net for those who are truly in need. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity by enforcing the Constitution, ensuring fiscal responsibility, and discharging our other stewardship responsibilities to other future generations. Yes, we can win the future if, in the first 3 words of the Constitution, these ideas come alive. We, the people, must speak the truth, the whole truth, while also insisting that our elected officials do the same. We, the people, must demand that the vital transformational changes in our nation's fiscal policy and political system take place to create a better future. We, the people, must take our civic responsibilities far more seriously than we have in recent years, rather than relying on the often empty promises of those who have failed to act on our behalf repeatedly in the past. And finally, we, the people, must hold our elected officials at all levels of government accountable for their failure to address the many large, known, and growing challenges that face our great nation. In the final analysis, we, the people, are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen in this Capitol and others around the nation. If we don't like the way things are going, we have an opportunity and indeed an obligation to act. We, the people, must recognize that ignorance and apathy are a toxic mix. Now is the time to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We all have a role to play, and with a renewed commitment and with united efforts, we can work to fulfill our duty to form a more perfect union for our country and for our families. Thank you for joining me. Happy Constitution Day. And I would be happy to answer some questions, but before I do, I'd like for Nick Troiano, who's with the Can Kicks Back, to come up and make some brief comments about their unprecedented national van tour to college campuses, following up on our national fiscal responsibility bus tour last fall. And by the way, before I forget, don't forget to get your copy of the report on the way out, a copy of my full remarks, a copy of the Constitution, and your Cracker Jack bag as well. Nick, please come up.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Dave, for the opportunity to speak today. Before I give an update on the Can Kicks Back, I want to say that I would not be here and our organization would not be doing the work that we're doing without us having sat through one of Dave's infamous chart talks about 4 years ago. Far from putting us to sleep, he called us to action. And that's when I met my co-founder, Ryan Schenege, and have worked over the past 4 years to make this organization come alive. And we've benefited from your advice and support ever since. There is no doubt that David Walker is the bald eagle of all the deficit hawks. And I don't mean to suggest anything else by that, except that he's a true leader of this movement. His efforts around the country have really illuminated our fiscal challenges and have inspired meaningful action, perhaps more than any other individual or organization out there. I remember what Dave said clearly 4 years ago, and that was young people are going to be disproportionately impacted, so they have to be disproportionately involved. And that's the mission of the Can Kicks Back. To build a constituency of young people to force our leaders to address this problem. Since launching last November, we've grown to over 20,000 supporters and 100 chapters across 38 states. As Dave said, next Wednesday we're embarking on a 5-week cross-country van tour, which will organize and participate in over 25 events to educate, organize, and mobilize our peers. We'll have a culminating event here in Washington, D.C. on October 30th. Called The Can Stops Here, to deliver hundreds, perhaps thousands of actual tin cans of messages of young people asking their leaders to fix the problem and not kick the can. I want to highlight 3 things we're going to be talking about on our tour. The first is a report that we released yesterday called Swindled, how Washington's paralysis, how millennials will pay the price of Washington's paralysis. And this shows that our national debt is far greater than what the politicians claim, and that as a result of current fiscal policy, today's seniors will have benefits coming to them far beyond their lifetime contributions, while tomorrow's seniors will be left with a bill far beyond their capacity to pay. Second, we'll be signing up new supporters to join our organization and activating them in a new way. People ask us, how do we defeat the debt? Well, now there's an app for that. We have it in the iTunes store. You can download it, and we'll be putting calls to action to our new supporters periodically. And lastly, we'll be building support for a bipartisan piece of legislation that our campaign has championed called the INFORM Act, which will force our leaders to reveal the true size and intergenerational consequences of our national debt. Above all, we'll be asking our supporters to pressure the leaders, but also to contact their parents and grandparents, because we're natural allies in the fight against the status quo. I'd encourage anyone interested in learning more to visit thecankicksback.org, and just want to reiterate that we're so grateful for Dave's great service to our organization and to the country over the past decade plus. Thank you.
Okay, I just got a note from Mike Murphy, thank you Mike, saying that the CBO's long-range forecast alternative scenario says public debt to GDP will be 190% by 2038. We need a plan that will get debt to GDP down to 60% by 2025, and given known demographic trends and rising healthcare costs, we'll be in a position to keep it there going forward. You cannot do that without leading with social insurance programs, healthcare costs, and comprehensive tax reform. Both political parties are responsible for where we are today. Both of them have allowed government to grow too big, promise too much, and have waited too long to restructure. And I want to mention one other thing before we go into Q&A. That is, Rick Foster's here. A lot of good friends are here. Rick Foster was the chief actuary of Medicare for a number of years. I, among other things in the past, was a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. Stan Ross, who was my fellow public trustee, we issued the first public trustees report where we told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about those programs and their need for restructuring. And Rick stood up at least twice to tell the truth about finances. First, with regard to Medicare prescription drugs, that it was adding $8 trillion in new unfunded promises when Medicare was already underfunded $20 trillion. And secondly, with regard to the Affordable Care Act, that it was not likely to save money over time, but in fact was likely to cost a lot more money over time, because we have to keep in mind, you can't expand coverage to 30 million plus new people and reduce health care costs. It's an oxymoron. Now, with that, let's go to Q&A, please. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming.
You mentioned that, in your opinion, about 60% of the American public, that's it, would more likely vote moderate for the sake of progress. So do you believe that the American voting public would be able to discourage career politicians over time, or do you think more specific action needs to be taken?
I think I've become convinced that to revitalize our democracy and to create a republic that is truly representative of and responsive to the public, that we've got to have political reforms. We need to have redistricting reform, where the purpose of redistricting is to maximize the number of competitive districts consistent with the Voting Rights Act, rather than to minimize the number of competitive districts consistent with the Voting Rights Act. Secondly, you can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican, you can be whatever you want, or you can be unaffiliated. Parties should be able to nominate their candidates, endorse them. They should be able to raise money for them, provide ground troops for them, but we should have one open and integrated primary where all qualified candidates run and the top two vote getters run off in the general election, irrespective of their political affiliation. Those things do not take constitutional amendments. Those things can be done at the state level. Several states have already done them, including California. We need campaign finance reform, including some consideration for public financing that's properly designed and effectively implemented. Some states have that. My state has that. Connecticut has that for statewide offices, not for federal offices. We need to also think about term limits. But those term limits need to be long enough to recognize that it's a complicated job, that you need some institutional memory. You don't want to have short limits, 12 to 18-year term limits. And even if we didn't end up starting the clock until after it was ratified by three-quarters of the states, 38 states, that's a small price to pay to be able to put us on a more prudent and sustainable path going forward. And as I said, I think it's time for an Article 5 convention called by the states. It may not have to happen. There are several times in the past where there was a threat of an Article 5 convention, the Bill of Rights, the 17th Amendment, the 25th Amendment. But what happened is it showed that the states have power and that it issued a wake-up call to this town to say that if you don't start doing something, we'll do something. And that's what this town needs. It needs a wake-up call and needs a call to action. Other questions? Yes?
What can we reasonably expect over the next few months?
I would like to say that we could get some type of a grand bargain this year. I think it's unrealistic to do that. I think we have to recognize there are several challenges. First, the year runs out on September 30. And so realistically, I think that they ought to be shooting for a short-term CR extension, maybe to do a continuing resolution for up to 2 months. Secondly, they need to recognize the need to fund the government for the full year, and they need to deal with the debt ceiling limit. While the President has said that he won't negotiate over the debt ceiling limit, and while there's absolutely no question that we have to raise the debt ceiling, because basically it's just recognizing the reality of policies that have been adopted by Congress and agreed to by the President over many years in the past, the fact is the President is going to have to negotiate, not necessarily over the debt ceiling, but he's going to have to negotiate over funding for the government for the entire year. And so I think realistically what ought to happen is we ought to try to replace the sequester as part of that funding with a more intelligent approach to reducing discretionary spending. We actually do need more investments in critical infrastructure that are properly designed and effectively implemented. And in my view, the most realistic approach with regard to the larger challenge is to get the Congress to agree that on a goal. Let's get debt to GDP to 60% by 2025. Let's give instructions to the committees of jurisdiction, the finance committees, et cetera, to come up with plans to hit that by a specific date that would be subject to congressional hearings and a variety of other things. Let's get the President and the congressional leaders to agree to go out and engage the people using deliberative democracy, using the approach that we did under the tour that gained 92% support for 6 principles for reform and a minimum of 77% support for specific reforms in Social Security, Medicare, health care, taxes, defense, and other areas. Minimum 77 up to 90. So I think we have to be realistic about what's possible, versus what we would like to happen. And as I said, when these things are enacted into law, they're going to be phased in. They're going to be phased in, but we'll get the power of compounding working for us rather than against us. And let me say one last thing. To get a political deal, you're going to have to delay the individual mandate. Not to repeal the Affordable Care Act, not to defund the Affordable Care Act, but you're going to have to delay the individual mandate. And I say that not just for a political reason. One of the things the federal government does the worst is integrated information systems. And I don't think the federal government is ready to effectively implement the Affordable Care Act, to understand who is eligible for what subsidy. So if that's in fact the case, and I believe it's the case, then it is also in the administration's interest to delay the implementation of the individual mandate so it is not an embarrassment. Yes.
Roman Gula with Madison Coalition. There's an argument, I'm sure you've heard it, that the debt problem is really medically analogous to an addiction. And if you look at the history of addictions, they require an outside intervention. You've referred to the idea of states giving Washington a wake-up call. I wonder if you could describe, if you think it would be a good idea, what some kind of fiscal discipline constitutional amendment might look like that could actually get bipartisan support.
Well, first, I think we need a combination of statutory restrictions and constitutional provisions. We've had statutory provisions in the past that have had some impact. We've had pay-as-you-go rules that affected not just the spending side, but the tax side, which I think you need both. We've had discretionary spending caps, but that didn't take an automatic across-the-board approach if intelligent decisions were made, okay? And so we've had different things in the past, and I think we need to bring back some of those things that worked. With regard to constitutional amendments, I know a lot of people talk about balanced budget amendments. Here's my concern about the balanced budget amendment. 49 of 50 states have balanced budget requirements. And you can count on this hand, maybe with fingers left over, how many really have a balanced budget based upon honest accounting. If states had balanced budgets, how do they have all this debt? How do they have all these structural problems? It's because the way they keep score does not fully reflect their financial condition, and because what they do is they balance cash flows. So that means they can accelerate revenues, they can delay expenses, and basically end up mortgaging the future, which is what is happening. So my concern is how would you structure a balanced budget amendment that would prevent that type of gaming? My preferred approach would be, we need a credit card limit. We need a limit as how much debt as a percentage of GDP that can be taken on absent a declaration of war or absent a supermajority vote by the Congress that would be extremely difficult to get. That, I think, would be a lot more effective, supplemented with those statutory provisions, if you will. I think we also need other things that don't require constitutional amendments. We need biennial budgeting. We need to look at investments different than we look at consumption. With regard to how we go about our budgeting process. et cetera. And, by the way, coming back to the deal, I think there are two things that have been talked about commissions that deserve serious consideration as part of a compromise this year. Number one, I think serious consideration to be given to creating a retirement income security commission. That's not just Social Security, that's private pensions and personal savings. We have a real problem there. And I think the second thing that needs to be considered is one dealing with government transformation. The Government Transformation Initiative is proposing to create a statutory commission of 7 qualified individuals who are not current government people, who have proven track records of success in transforming organizations, that would look at the high-risk list that GAO has done, the many recommendations that have come out of GAO, the Inspectors General, the good work that's been done by OMB, congressional staff, various think tanks, and that would end up coming up with a series of reports that would make specific, actionable recommendations that would be guaranteed hearings and guaranteed an up or down vote in Congress. This is one of the provisions of the Make Government Work agenda proposed by the problem solvers of No Labels. It's one of 9 legislative proposals. Everybody ought to be able to agree that we want to be economical, efficient, and effective. We can debate what government ought to do, how big government ought to be, how much we ought to cut spending versus increase revenues to achieve sustainability, but we need to get the most out of whatever resources we have. And if we think we're going to get it through the normal order, we're kidding ourselves. Remember what Einstein said? If you expect the same people doing the same thing to generate different results, that's the definition of insanity. And that's where we are today. Other questions? Back in the back, sir. Oh, Thierry, how are you? Well, I think we have a retirement security problem, and I'm focusing right now on income security, but in many cases, the health is a bigger problem. Let's take Connecticut as an example. Connecticut has the highest liabilities and unfunded promises per taxpayer of any state in the Union. And the primary drivers of it are not just the debt that's on the balance sheet, it's the underfunded pensions and the unfunded retiree health obligations that grow faster than inflation and faster than the economy when the economy grows. And so these are serious challenges. Now, when you look at the retirement income security issue, you have to recognize that Social Security was intended to be a base of retirement income, a foundation. It was intended to be supplemented with private pensions, personal savings. And yet, the truth is, today, 22% of Americans rely solely on Social Security. Over 50% rely on it for a majority of their retirement income. That's not intended to be that way, but that's reality. And so we have to be able to look at these different issues and also get our savings rate up. We've got to get our savings rate up. We are unduly dependent upon others to finance our excess consumption, and that is not in our economic or national security interest. Yes. Maybe 2 or 3 more questions. John?
The British seem to have made a lot more progress in this area. They've got a plan now for reducing the debt to GDP ratio. They've done that because of the revival largely of the Liberal Party, which was dormant for 50, 60 years. Now it has basically a plurality.
Plurality, yeah.
Thank you. And what's the possibility of an independent movement in the political process as neither Republican or
Yeah,
Democrat?
right.
But we're a federal system, that's a problem. But what's the probability?
Well, we have a duopoly now, meaning the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that has undue control over ballot access and that have a share of voters that are declining. The largest share of voters are unaligned, unaffiliated, independent voters, over 40% and growing. And so my view is the answer is not necessarily to have a new political party, but it is a new political movement of concerned Democrats, concerned Republicans, concerned independents who can come together. But I also believe that we're going to have these political reforms. in order to deal with some of the challenges that we face, including ballot access. 2 more questions. Yes.
My name is Ken Gordon. I'm from Clean Slates Now. I'm here with Americans for Campaign Reform. We work on the money and politics issue. And I think everything you say is exactly accurate, but I look at all the money in the world opposing these changes because they benefit from the status quo. And a lot of the dysfunction is in order to get them short-term profits, like medical health care is a big
Right.
good example. So I'd like to just see if you have a suggestion for going a level down and saying, what do you do when your opposition is profit-oriented, selfish, and only looks at the short-term profits that they can make in their industries, and they put money against every reform
Yeah.
that you suggest?
Well, I mean, first, we suffer from myopia, nearsightedness, tunnel vision, looking at one issue at a time, and self-interest. All right? Those have reached epidemic proportions, especially in politics, but in other parts of society, okay? My view is truth and transparency is necessary for transformation. My view is that most people understand that we have a problem, and my view is a significant majority of Americans are willing to come behind a movement designed to address these issues. For example, when you talk about the underfunded pensions and unfunded retiree health care, I believe very strongly that federal and state and local workers ought to have decent pensions and retiree health plans. But they ought to be comparable, affordable, and sustainable. Fairness means not just to them, it means to the taxpayers who have to pay it. It means you got to benchmark it against the others. And so the answer is that, yeah, we know we have those forces. So what are you going to do to be able to make it evident that those forces are looking out for their own self-interest or trying to perpetuate the status quo, and the status quo is unacceptable and unsustainable? One last question, if anybody has one. Yes.
Question on term limits and also on, just as you have spawned new organizations and young people, what messages have you found are leading to new generations of candidates? Because you can talk about all the structural reforms you want, but what we need are informed people who have the courage to lead on Capitol Hill. Are you finding that from the new organizations you're helping to spawn?
Yes.
People you're inciting out there, that people, despite the stagnation in Washington, are willing to run for office and address some of these issues?
Well, the truth is we need more people like Nick and Ryan and Mike and Rachel and others. But the good news is that we're starting to get those generations engaged more, all right? And their message is resonating, and they're starting to understand that they have a disproportionate, need to get engaged here, and they should do so for their own self-interest and for the interest of our country, in the future. That's starting to happen. I do think we need a new generation of leaders, and I'm hopeful that we'll get some. I want to thank all of you. I want to remind you, please pick up a copy of the report, my remarks, the extended remarks. Please get a Constitution, and don't forget your Cracker Jacks. Happy Constitution Day. Thank you.
Questioner, I recognize him.
Steve Katz.
Steve Katz.
You know Steve.
Yeah.
You know Steve. Hey, man. Thanks.